Hey guys, it's Andrew here, and today's video is a head-to-head comparison and review of two popular car paint compounds in the form of Menzerna heavy cut compound known as HCC400 and Koch Chemie heavy cut compound known as H902. I'll try and keep this intro short, but I think it's important to set the stage so we're all on the same page. Firstly, both Menzerna and Koch Chemie do have a lot of compounds, many of which I have used and tested out. But as a direct comparison of two detailer-focused, adaptable and versatile cutting compounds, I do think HCC400 and H902 are the two most closely matched and best all-round cutting compounds both brands have to offer. Menzerna more recently released Cutforce Pro, which I do want to review, and look, maybe it could be a competitor to H902 and I'm happy to line them up. But I have a feeling it's going to be more of a medium to coarse compound, closer to 3D1, maybe even Sonex Perfect Finish, but we'll see, and I'm open to your suggestions. I've also tested both brands' more purely cut-focused compounds, such as Menzerna Super Heavy Cut 300 and Koch Chemie H701, and look, they certainly can be very capable and extreme cutting compounds, but personally I don't like either of those compounds as they feel a little outdated, have degraded user experience, and absolutely horrific finishes that feels like I'm back in the 90s. Compounds have come such a long way, and although I understand there's still a place for some old school one-trick pony compounds, the thing to appreciate is that when a compound has such a terrible finish, you firstly eliminate the possibility of a one-step correction process, which I do think HCC400 and H902 are capable of. But secondly, even in a two-step correction, it becomes difficult and time-consuming to refine those very coarse compound marks. So what's meant to be a quick and easy second stage of polishing becomes a very labour-induced endeavour that can end up taking just as long as the first cutting stage. And lastly, when you have to endure compounding dust storms, splatter, sticky wipe-offs and so on, that also slows you down and honestly breaks you down both physically and mentally. What I'm trying to highlight is that yes, it's vital that a great compound is capable at cutting, but if that's all it has to offer and becomes an uphill battle from there, you may find that such a tunnel vision approach makes your journey that much steeper and longer. As with most of my reviews, I'll try and provide some of the brand's own information on screen, but I'm less interested in an ingredient list, the brand's hyped up claims, and working within stringent parameters. In my opinion, a good car compound stands up on its own merits and is flexible enough to adapt to a wide variety of users, environments, techniques, and they'll be judged as such. I'll be assessing the user experience, cutting and finishing abilities of the compounds, and spreading that across a spectrum of diverse paints, defects, machines, pads, methods, and situations. And I'll also do my best to provide some helpful paint correction tips along the way. In a nutshell, I'm gathering and sharing information, some of which you may or may not find helpful, and I'll also be providing my own personal opinions, some of which you may or may not agree with, which is absolutely fine. In any case, this video was quite a bit of work to plan, film and produce, so I do hope there's some value in it, especially for you amazing CCAD viewers, and let's get to it. I'll do my best to show you some corresponding footage and display some of the text on screen to what I'm using and discussing when possible. But as there was dozens of on and off camera tests performed, which I think is the best way to gather and confirm reliable data, I will have to summarize a lot of my findings and jump around a little to keep this video moving at a decent pace. So here on this fender panel, which has more of a medium hardness paint and a variety of heavy, moderate and lighter defects, I'm going to do more of a typical one-step polishing cycle, using the same light cutting foam pad, method and technique for both compounds. The goal here with a one-step is to find a balance. So I'm probably not going to be able to remove the more severe defects with this pad, but hopefully most of the moderate to lighter ones will be eliminated. And I'm probably not going to achieve the best finish either, but hopefully it'll still be reasonable. Technique-wise, I'm just using 3 small drops on a fresh pad, starting out with a mid machine speed and light to moderate pressure, And then halfway through my cycle, I'm going to switch to a faster machine speed and use a little more pressure to finish off. Now, after completing one side with Menzerna HCC400, there's no denying it's a great result. I would say a good 70% plus defect removal, with an additional great improvement in gloss and clarity for such a quick and easy polishing method. So let's now repeat the very same process with Koch Chemie H902, and then I'll shine some of that great disinfecting light on the panel, which I like to call Truth Serum, to really highlight the results achieved in both sections. Now, I would say that the side with H902 has more like 80 to 90% defect removal, and when we look at the finish, both sides still certainly have some compounding haze, but there's just no denying that H902 has finished with better gloss, clarity, and saturation. So based on this test, maybe I've achieved about 25% more cut with Koch Chemie, but the bigger difference is the finish, which I would say is closer to 50% better at least. So let's have another go at these two sections, but this time in a two-step process to see if I can achieve both a better cut and finish with each compound. So for the first cutting stage, I'm using a microfiber pad, which will typically produce far more cut than a foam pad, priming it beforehand, which I do recommend with microfiber pads, and I'll be using a touch more compound. But apart from that, my speed, pressure, and so forth will be the same as the previous set. And for those of you who may be a little newer to paint correction, the first step in a two-step paint correction process is the cutting step, where we remove the actual existing paint defects. The second step, or any other step that follows, is all about refining the finish, or gloss and clarity improvements, which I'll go through in a bit. Now, having a quick look at the results, hopefully you can see that 95% plus of the defects are gone. There is a whole heap of compounding haze and marring in the finish, which is to be expected. And I have, unfortunately, created a couple of burn marks on the sharp body lines. Lucky this is a test panel, hey? But let's keep going with the second step, where I used a lighter foam polishing pad, 2 very small drops of compound, started with a higher machine speed and more pressure, and then about halfway through lowered my speed and eased off the pressure. So whereas the previous step was all about trying to increase, prolong, and maximize cut, this step is all about trying to minimize and break down the compound as fast as possible so that the abrasives are less in number, smaller, and smoother, which will allow for a better finish. Then I'll once again repeat the process on the other side. But just to be clear guys, no, you typically wouldn't use a cutting compound like these to both cut and finish in a two-stage process. Usually you'd use a finer polish for the second stage. But I'm trying to demonstrate how well these compounds can cut and potentially finish, at least on this medium hard paint, to gather and share information. It's also important to note that if the paint or clear coat is harder, the finish will typically be better. And if the paint is softer, the finish will typically be worse with both these compounds, generally speaking. Having a look at the results, the defect removal on both sides is 95% plus, which typically is what we strive for in high-end results. So on that front, it's a fantastic outcome. However, the finish, as expected, isn't generally as good, but as I mentioned, this is more about gathering information. Now, although the finish on the right side with Koch Chemie certainly isn't as good as it gets, it's still quite reasonable for something like a quicker one-step correction, and it can in fact be acceptable. The left side with Menzerna, on the other hand, just has a little too much haze and marring to be an acceptable finish. But having said that, it's not that bad for a coarse cutting compound, and will be reasonably easy to clean up as a finer polish for the second stage. Now while I'm here, and just so you guys can understand where I'm coming from, I wanted to show you what a truly bad finishing compound looks like. So I did a quick set using Menzerna Super Heavy Cut 300, and I'm not letting Koch Chemie off the hook here as their H902 isn't that much better. But even apart from the finish, the smell of this compound is just over the top and headache inducing, and the wipe off, oh my, the wipe off is just simply ridiculous and like pulling teeth.
This is ridiculous.
But to get back to the point of this quick little test, if you thought the finish of HCC400 was bad, just have a look at this. I don't even think the footage here does it justice, as in person the paint turned matte and about 50 shades of grey lighter in that section. And this is a medium metallic paint that's great at hiding defects. Just try this compound on a soft black gloss paint and you'll be in for a world of pain trying to refine its finish. The next round of testing, which is actually where I began filming for this video, is a little more mundane, which is why I started the video with the previous panel that I think was a little bit more revealing or interesting to the viewer. Having said that, I used this phase of testing to help dial in the best methods and techniques with these two compounds, and it was very helpful in understanding how these compounds respond to things like higher and lower machine speeds, more or less downward pressure, longer or shorter polishing cycles, and we'll even get into some dual action versus rotary polishing in a bit. Now, so we're all on the same page, this red test panel does have an extremely hard clear coat, which basically means paint defects are far more difficult and time consuming to remove compared to a medium or softer paint type. To add insult to injury, I've also created some quite rough and inconsistent sanding marks on purpose, as I wanted to perform several polishing sets comparing different techniques and assessing the results, but without removing all the defects at once, as that wouldn't provide the information I'm after. You'll be pleased to hear that I'm not going to subject you to all the step-by-step trial and error testing that took place here, and what's that you say? Thank you! Well, you're welcome. Instead, I'm just going to share my findings here. Firstly, it's not like you have to use a very specific or stringent method, technique, or pad combination with either of these compounds in order to achieve a great result. I tested a number of diverse polishing techniques and pads with great success. So, as with all paints, defects, environments, and user skill levels, it's not like there's a one-size-fits-all solution every time. However, I did still experience some increased and repeatable success when using some particular techniques that I'll discuss. Both compounds do seem to achieve a more consistent and increased edge-to-edge cut within a normal size section if you do start on a slower to mid-machine speed and with light to moderate pressure. What seems to happen with both compounds if you do go too fast and heavy immediately is that the first row or two passes in your section do have great cut, but the rest of the section can display a reduced cut. But I will add that this seemed to be more obvious on harder paints and less visible on softer paints. So there seems to be an advantage on harder paints with more severe defects if you prolong or slow the breaking down of the compound's abrasives. That rewards you with a more consistent and perhaps even greater overall cutting ability. However, about halfway through a typical polishing set, or when both compounds seem to go past that peak cutting phase, that's the point where bumping up the machine speed and increasing downward pressure helps extract more cut as the abrasives begin to diminish more rapidly. The added bonus here is that it also helps the abrasives get smaller and smoother to create a better finish that will be easier to refine if need be. So there's actually a lot more in common with these two compounds in the way that they seem to perform best compared to their differences. Having said that, there certainly still are some differences. Menzerna HCC400 does seem to work faster, meaning if you do a quicker or shorter side-by-side polishing set, you'd typically see a little more cut or defect removal in its section compared to Koch Chemie H902. So Menzerna does, based on my testing, cut very quickly and impressively from the get-go, but it also does seem to peak and then diminish a little quicker. Whereas Koch Chemie takes an extra row of passes and a little bit more time to get to the same place, but still seems to keep producing a little more cut for longer. So as I did some side-by-side tests and stopped to assess the results, what I did tend to see is that in the first 1 or 2 row pass sets, Menzerna was ahead in cut. About 3 to 4 row sets, the results were pretty even. And once I moved to 5 row passes or more, Koch Chemie seemed to pull away. It also became apparent that after 4 to 5 row passes with Menzerna, or let's say about 2 minutes of polishing in total, it had really done all it's going to do, meaning it reached the top end of both its cut and its finishing capabilities. Whereas with Koch Chemie, I did find that there can be an advantage of doing an extra row of passes or spending an extra 30 seconds or so in your set to extract both a little more cut and a better finish. But my feeling was that Menzerna's abrasives may start off a little bigger or more aggressive, but also break down a little quicker, though they don't break down or smooth out quite as much in the end. Whereas Koch Chemie's abrasives aren't as large or aggressive to begin with, but do hold their cut for longer and will by the end reach a smaller or smoother state to aid a better finish. I think this will be displayed better to the viewer as we move on to some other paints, but in any case, that was my sense of what was going on based on the results of my testing. This grey test panel also has a hard clear coat, not as rock hard as the previous red test panel, but nonetheless still hard. And this panel is where I focused a little more on rotary and wool pad use that seemed to more so highlight the cutting differences between the two compounds. So this is where I continued testing out various techniques with the rotary, using higher and lower speeds, more and less pressure, and shorter and longer polishing cycles. But once again, I did find that if I started on a slower speed with less pressure for the first couple of row pass sets, and then moved to a mid-machine speed with moderate pressure for the final few row pass sets, this was giving me the best and most uniform cut and finish. The only real difference here was using a slightly faster arm speed and that my sets were more like 60 to 90 seconds long in total. Basically, the wool pads and the rotary do work and break down the compounds much faster, so you do get there quicker, and if you don't stop at that point, you will start to produce excessive heat, dusting, and a little bit more of a difficult wipe off. So let's get into some of the findings here. I did 3 sets of compounding on this panel, and after each set, the right side with Koch Chemie had about 20% better defect removal, so times that by 3 sets of polishing and the difference of cut by the end was very apparent. Now obviously we don't want to correct or compound car paint several times over to achieve the desired result. Why? Because it's just too time consuming. But as I mentioned earlier, I did this to gather and hopefully share valuable information. I think the main takeaway here was that because wool and a rotary are still perhaps the most aggressive and demanding pad machine combinations available, it helped even more so highlight the cutting differences between these two compounds, the more extreme ends, or when they're pushed to their limits. It just seemed that Koch Chemie did have more cut to offer, but the more interesting thing to me was having a look at some of the finishes here, where there was more aggressive compounding and hologram marks in its section, which is strange considering that in all the other tests I've done so far, Koch Chemie does seem to finish a little better. We can even have a look here after I performed a follow-up lighter second stage using a foam polishing pad to clean up the compounding haze and holograms, and it was pretty amazing how well I could finish with both these compounds on this harder paint type with the right pad and technique combination. But to get back to the point I was trying to make, it took some more rotary testing to truly appreciate it, but there is some extra flexibility that Koch Chemie H902 has that if you do want to go a little harder, but still within reason, it can give you a pretty aggressive cut, yet when you tone it down, it can also finish better than you'd expect. Now, I could say the very same thing about Menzerna HCC400. The only real difference is the width of that spectrum. Koch Chemie just has a bit more cut at the top end and a little increased finish at the lower end. But if you don't venture to those more extreme ends with your combination and techniques and just keep it more basic, you may not even see or experience those differences. As I've touched on this whole video, the paint type you're working on and how you adapt to it has a massive effect on the results you achieve. So let's have a look at a very soft and sensitive clear coat on a gloss black paint. Now, although this paint has a few deeper scratches, most of the defects are light to moderate micro scratches, swirls and haze. So with that in mind, it is important to realize that the real challenge of this paint isn't going to be removing the defects, it's going to be finishing well. So with that understanding, I should be tuning my combination and technique to finish as good as possible, because I could use almost any cutting compound here and the cut would come regardless. But if I don't adapt my pad and technique combination, the finish could be so bad that it's actually worse than what I started with, and then it becomes a nightmare to try and refine the paint even in a multi-step correction process. Now, as we have a look at the results, I'll repeat that a coarse compound isn't the ideal grade of polish to finish well on a soft car paint. But for the purpose of gathering and sharing information, hopefully you can see that firstly, Menzerna HCC400 was certainly able to remove the majority of the existing defects and improve the finish in a very light, quick polishing step, though it's fair to say that it's also left a lot of its own compounding haze and marring in the finish. And as we repeat the same process with Koch Chemie on the other side, using the same optimal finishing technique, it's not like we have a perfect finish either. And if this is the result I would have gotten using a fine or even a medium or one-step compound, I wouldn't be all that impressed. But seriously, for any coarse cutting compound that has this much cut to finish this well on a soft, sticky paint is actually quite unbelievable. I did my best to try and test quite a few things in this area, such as the major user experience deal breakers like dusting and the wipe off. But apart from that, I also tested pad residue buildup and control, what the pads are like to clean and blow out, the lubrication of the compounds, and whether it aids the pad's rotational spin, helps reduce heat, as well as the potential for product sling, especially with rotary use. Firstly, I don't really have any major issues or gripes with either of these products in these areas, but there are a couple of things to touch on. I know some people have complained about dusting with both these compounds, maybe Menzerna HCC more so, but I don't necessarily agree. Both these compounds have been updated over the past decade. Koch Chemie H902 started out as H801 and has gone through several updates to the H902 we currently have, and I believe this latest formula is the lowest dusting one so far. Menzerna started out as FG400, then HCC400, and although the name hasn't changed since, it has 100% had its formula updated in the last few years, where it also doesn't seem to dust as much as it used to. So I feel like a lot of the dusting complaints may be based on older formulations of these compounds. As I found, yes, they do dust a little, but I think it's well within reason, and I don't feel one is necessarily worse than the other. But there is one little caveat worth mentioning. With normal polishing cycles, let's say in more typical climates, what I've just stated is what I believe to be true. Both compounds have a good user experience and there's not much in it from one to the other. However, on one day of testing, I was faced with some pretty extreme heat and humidity, and that's when Menzerna HCC400 seemed to become stickier to wipe off than Koch Chemie and also had a little more dust. Another thing to understand is that if you don't work in and break down a compound enough, the wipe off does become quite horrible. And the same thing happens if you overwork the compound or introduce too much heat. The wipe off again is quite terrible. So all compounds have a sweet spot and a minimum and maximum working range. And a part of my testing was just seeing what happens at the more extreme ends. And once again, when I pushed both compounds, Koch Chemie H902 did seem to have a little more forgiveness if the environment or my method and technique wasn't ideal. So, not to sound like a broken record, but it was at the more extreme ends when the differences between these two compounds seemed to surface the most. I'll also add that in rotary use, more so with foam pads, I did on several occasions experience Menzerna HCC400 creating more excessive heat and starting to ball up the compound into these little rubber clumps that it spat out. That's why I also felt that HCC400 does seem to favour wool pads. Maybe it's a heat thing as wool does tend to run cooler than foam, but it could also be a lubrication thing, and I'll admit that I'm not entirely sure. If I had any other revelations in any of the user experience areas, I certainly would share them here, but the truth is I didn't see any substantial issues or differences, except when the compounds were pushed a little more than they should be. So perhaps if you are working in a more extreme climate, or perhaps your method and technique isn't quite on point, you may find some more forgiveness with Koch Chemie H902, but otherwise with most normal use, I think both compounds are quite nice and very reasonable to use. So let's wrap up this video while I still have a little voice left in me. The first thing I want to make clear is that almost everything I've discussed, from the cut to the finish and the user experience of these two compounds, is based on a summary of averages collected during a few dozen tests I performed over about a week. This means it's not like every individual test I did rendered the same results. But if a large enough percentage of the test results swayed a certain way, to the point where it was a clear, consistent pattern, that's what I based my conclusions on. And if it wasn't clear, like many of the user experience characteristics, I also wanted to be upfront that I couldn't make a call either way, or that there was some reason or another that the results may have gone a certain way. The second thing I wanted to make clear is that the general techniques I favoured with these compounds, such as starting slow and light and then increasing speed and pressure to maximise cut, or doing the opposite and starting faster and heavier and then going slower and lighter to maximize finish quality, aren't mandatory requirements with either of these two compounds. They both work just fine regardless of whether you wish to work more precisely to their strengths and characteristics or not. I don't typically change speeds and pressure during most polishing cycles, and when I also didn't do that while testing, the results were still very good. I was just trying to explain that if you do want to or need to extract that extra 10 or 20% of cut or finish, that's how you can go about extracting it out of these compounds. Otherwise, it's not like the results are going to be terrible either way. There's a few truly great and versatile cutting compounds that have really stood out throughout my detailing career and that I would call exceptional. The first coarse compound that really changed the game in my opinion was Meguiar's M105. This was the first time I ever experienced a great cutting compound that could also finish unbelievably well. There was just nothing like it at the time, and it was so good that it changed the compound market forever. The next was Menzerna Fast Gloss 400. It took a few years, but FG400 and then HCC400 was the only compound I used at the time that was honestly a touch better than M105. A little more cut and maybe even a slightly better finish, which I'm sure was no easy task to produce. Since then, I can add a few more cutting compounds like NV Precision, the Last Cut Compounding Glaze, maybe even more recently Scholl S2 Black. But all of this can be subjective because we all look for different things and work differently, So in the end, it has to come down to what you personally value and have great success with. I haven't used Koch Chemie H902 enough to know whether it will also make this list, but I have to say I am extremely impressed with what I've seen so far. I did review Koch Chemie H901 a couple of years ago and I certainly still liked it. But H902 seems to have more cut, less dust in, potentially even a better finish, wipe off and more flexibility than its predecessor. Menzerna HCC400 is, has been and will always be an outstanding compound in my eyes. So for Koch Chemie H902 to do so well up against a compound legend speaks volumes to me. The last thing I'll say is that although Koch Chemie has been around for some time now, it's really been a mess of a brand to buy or realistically get into here in Australia. It's been way overpriced, hard to get a hold of, and just very confusing and random with new and old stock availability. So part of what spurred this review for me is that finally, after so many years, it seems as though the brand is serious about the Australian market and gotten its act together here locally. So let me officially welcome you to this great nation of ours and viel Glück. I think I'll leave it there. I hope you guys enjoyed and found value in this video. I pray you all keep the Lord close and dear in your hearts. Stay strong, stay faithful, and I'll see you in the next video.